Welcome back to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the mid-19th century in Canada East. If you've ever wondered exactly why French is the official language of Quebec today, well, the answer really traces back to the 1800s. Back then, a massive majority of the population in Canada East were French speakers, known as Canadiens. We're going to explore how extreme economic hardship, combined with some seriously intense British pressure, inadvertently forged the fiercely unified French-Canadian identity that we still see today. Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We'll start with the Canadian economic divide, then move on to abandoning the ancestral farm, followed by women in the workforce. After that, we'll look at resisting British assimilation, and finally, forging a national identity. Section 1. The Canadian economic divide. To truly wrap our heads around this profound cultural shift, we have to look at the stark economic reality on the ground. During the mid-1800s, English businessmen completely dominated the booming economies of major hubs like Montreal and Quebec City. It was an era of massive prosperity for the business elite, but there was a huge, gaping divide between that English wealth and the deep poverty of the Canadian working class. And the crucial piece of the puzzle here is the land ownership system, known as the seigneurial system. You had wealthy landowners, seigneurs, who held vast tracts of land and rented out much smaller plots to Canadian farmers. A perfect example is the incredibly wealthy Papineau family. They owned a staggering 178,000 acres along the Ottawa River. While the Papineaus were profiting immensely from sawmills and massive commercial farms, their Canadian tenant farmers were desperately struggling to survive on credit, often finding themselves totally unable to make their payments. And that brings us to a quote that brilliantly illustrates the harsh reality of this class divide. In an 1852 letter, Louis-Joseph Papineau, a major politician and a wealthy seigneur himself, wrote that a lack of foresight, ignorance, the tendency to become indebted to the merchants are the common failings of all the habitants without exception. Notice the attitude there. Powerful seigneurs like Papineau viewed their struggling, indebted tenants with intense disgust, rather than any kind of sympathy. So when these farmers couldn't pay up, they were forced to surrender their plots or sell them back to the Papineaus for just a fraction of what they originally paid. Section 2. Abandoning the ancestral farm. This vicious cycle of debt leads us right into our next major societal shift, because families were suddenly forced to make impossible choices. Just to put this dramatic data point into perspective, unable to pay off crushing debts to merchants and seigneurs, generations of families who had seen their plots divided again and again were literally starved off their own land. Hundreds of thousands of families abandoned their farms, and this triggered an absolute demographic explosion in the cities. Back in 1800, only about 5% of Canada East's population lived in cities. But by 1867, that number leaped to 20%. It was a massive, desperate wave of urbanization. Now, to really understand what that migration felt like on a human level, listen to this excerpt from Patrice Lacombe's 1846 novel, The Ancestral Farm. He writes, "After seeing himself completely ruined, Chauvin finally decided to come and seek shelter in the city. They arrived in droves, almost doubling the population of our suburbs. Even though this is a work of fiction, it perfectly hits the nail on the head regarding the desperation of the time. Men who used to farm were now violently competing for cheap jobs in the lumber industry, which drove wages down so incredibly low that families still had to borrow money just to put food on the table." Section 3. Women in the workforce. With wages slashed and men unable to support their households alone, the entire family dynamic had to fundamentally change. Factory owners quickly realized they could pay women and children significantly less than men for doing the exact same work. It was a staggering level of exploitation. Just listen to this testimony from an 1874 government hearing featuring Mr. Muir, a Montreal clothing manufacturer. When asked if the surplus population allowed him to get cheap labor, he openly replied, "Yes. In fact, it makes my heart ache to have the women come crying for work." By 1871, the clothing industry employed about 20% of Montreal's entire manufacturing workforce, and a massive 80% of those workers were Canadian women and children. And this gender labor divide quickly spread across multiple industries. Because women were routinely paid less than men across the board, whether they were sewing garments, working as servants, or even sorting rock at copper mines, employers just pivoted. Take the teaching profession in Quebec, for example. From 1853 to 1859, the percentage of female teachers rose dramatically to 69%, while male teachers plummeted to just 31%. Teaching, much like factory work, became highly dependent on the cheap labor of women. Section 4. Resisting British assimilation. So while the working class was being economically exploited in the cities, an even larger, macro-level political danger emerged against the French majority. This right here is the central conflict of the entire era, especially following the 1840 Act of Union. On one side, you have the British goal of assimilation, which was an explicit attempt to force French speakers to adapt to English customs and entirely erase the French language from the colony. On the other side, you have the Canadian goal of nationalism, a fierce effort by local leaders to protect their heritage, language, religion, and culture. The English-dominated government was trying to systematically wipe out French culture, and the Canadians fought back incredibly hard. In fact, the Canadian pushback was so intense and so unified that even top British officials realized it was a losing battle. Governor General Lord Metcalfe literally said in 1843, "If the Canadians are to be ruled to their satisfaction, every attempt to metamorphose them systematically into English must be abandoned." He, along with others, recognized that forced assimilation was an absolute political powder keg, and it had to be completely dropped if they ever wanted peace. Section 5. Forging a National Identity. Driven off their farms, exploited in the booming cities, and politically threatened, the Canadians deliberately constructed a distinctly unified national identity. The Catholic Church stepped up as a massive cultural and economic powerhouse during this time. Bishops and priests were traveling everywhere, loudly tying religion directly to patriotism. The church also gained immense financial influence by investing heavily in the very industries transforming the landscape, like railways and lumber. They used this new industrial wealth to fund major cultural institutions, most notably founding Laval University in 1852. It was the very first French-language university in British North America, and it helped convince Canadians that they were the true chosen leaders of Catholicism in the Americas. Meanwhile, outside the church, a growing French-speaking middle class eagerly embraced arts and literature to solidify this new identity. Writers started deliberately creating Canadian folk heroes. A perfect example is Joseph Montfrand. He was a real-life, legendary lumberjack and strongman, famously known for physically defending his fellow Canadians from British bullies. Authors and poets turned men like him into cultural icons. Through plays, novels, and art, they constantly reminded working-class Canadians that they had a deep, proud history long before the British ever arrived. Which really brings us to where we are today. The history of Canada East isn't just a story about farming or factories, it's a story of pure survival. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. When you look at modern-day Quebec, with its fiercely protected French language and distinct culture, how much of that identity was forged directly in the fires of 19th-century debt, forced urbanization, and an unyielding resistance to British assimilation? It really makes you see the entire province in a completely new light, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.